Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Hank Hyatt, SVP of Economic Competitiveness at the Greenville Chamber. October is a time to celebrate manufacturing across the country. For many years, the Chamber has hosted a manufacturing celebration. And for the past 3 years, the Chamber, Greenville County Schools, and Greenville Tech have partnered with manufacturers to provide in-person tours for more than 900 students as part of Manufacturing Day. The pandemic, et cetera, we've shifted to more of a digital strategy this year. Starting today, the Chamber will host 4 Manufacturing Matters webinars that will also be recorded and stored on the Greenville Chamber's Launch Greenville internship platform. These webinars are career pathways in manufacturing and how students and young adults can access those opportunities. We have investors who are tuning in today and other attendees will share the videos with their family members, students, and others especially interested in manufacturing careers. A few housekeeping points today. First, all attendees should be on mute with your cameras turned off. You can submit questions through the chat feature. We've got a lot to talk about today, but if there's some time at the end, we do want to take questions. So, Manufacturing Matters is sponsored by several organizations. Our gold sponsor is GSA Business and the 2020 South Carolina Manufacturing Conference and Expo, which is being held virtually this year, October 29th and 30th. We will place a link in the chat and a bit later for you to find out more info. Our other presenting sponsor is Greenville Technical College. They're one of our 2 presenting sponsors, and we'll have them on later in the series during our final Manufacturing Matters segment. With us today, though, our presenting sponsor is Recruiting Solutions. We're pleased to have with us today from California, I believe, Cam Varner, President of Recruiting Solutions. I'll turn this over to Cam.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hank, and thank you to the Greenville Chamber for putting this on and for the job that you guys have just done in the upstate. I graduated from Eastside High School, and the change that has happened in Greenville over the course of the last 10 years or so has just been unreal. Every time I go up there, there's new businesses, new roads, so it's an exciting time, and that is in large part due to the Chamber and all the other partners in the upstate. So a little bit about our company. We were founded by my father in 1992, and we're most well known as a staffing agency, but we also provide HR consulting services. We do contact center solutions, and we do just your traditional headhunting. So if you're in the upstate and you need help with a staffing partner, please reach out to us.
Thanks, Cam. We appreciate your longtime support of our manufacturing celebration. You've been with us for many years now, and we appreciate your making the transition to virtual with us. Before we dive into our speakers today, can you tell us, from your perspective, any trends you're seeing from the staffing perspective?
Yeah, so we're seeing a bounce back, and that is awesome. We had an extremely slow second quarter, and manufacturing was one of the sectors that was really down. But we had a third quarter bounce back that has been strong. And we're actually positioned for what we think will be our strongest fourth quarter ever. So that's exciting news. And we have a unique position in the economy in the sense that we see a lot of different businesses in a lot of different industries. And across the board, we have seen a pickup. But really with automotive and consumer staples, those have been what have picked up the most for us.
That's good news to hear. Well, turning it over now to our 2 featured speakers for today. We're joined today by Ray Owens and Mark Ferris. Ray is Senior Economist and Policy Advisor for the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond. Ray created the Richmond Fed's monthly surveys of manufacturing and service sector activity. He published academic articles on monetary policy, financial markets, and economic development policy as well. Glad to have you with us today, Ray.
Pleasure to be here, of course. First, I want to thank you for having me and say how excited, how thrilled I am to have this opportunity.
Well, thank you. So let me introduce our next speaker real quick and get into your presentation.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Mark Ferris, our second speaker, is President and CEO of the Greenville Area Development Corporation. Mark has more than 30 years of experience in economic development in South Carolina. He's assisted company location expansion projects totaling over $5 billion in capital investment and 33,000 jobs in that time. He was president and CEO of the Greenville Area Development Corporation in October of 2014, where he leads the industrial and business recruitment efforts of the largest county in South Carolina. So good morning to you as well, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Surely. Well, in order to get a good picture of health of manufacturing, it's helpful to have solid data. So that's why we've got Ray here. So have you here. We want to give you, want you to basically give us a quick overview of the Federal Reserve, what data you track, and really provide your take on the manufacturing sector. And then when we get done with your presentation, we'll go down to the more local level and see what's on the radar with GADC and Mark. So if that sounds good to y'all, we'll dive in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again very much. And I have 15 minutes or so, and I have basically three things to cover. I want to talk just very, very briefly about the Federal Reserve, what it does and why monitoring the economy is important. And then I want to go into overall economic conditions, our take on what's happened in the last several years, because that's important to the manufacturing sector. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about manufacturing as an industry and perhaps some of the factors driving both its current activity, but also prospects for the future. That said, I need to be fairly quick, and let's begin with this first slide describing the Federal Reserve. And the essence of the Federal Reserve is it's the nation's central bank. Now, that's perhaps not terribly meaningful to most people, but I can tell you that this involves a number of responsibilities in the U.S. economy. The one, though, that I think most people are familiar with, perhaps the key role, is conducting monetary policy. Now, this roughly means that we're to provide enough money so the economy can reach its full growth potential over time. Now, that its full growth potential is a number. It can't be too fast or things get overheated, or too slow. Turning to the next slide then, conducting monetary policy will mean, on the next slide perhaps.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Conducting monetary policy in this context will mean that the Fed typically lowers interest rates when economic performance in the U.S. is falling short. It's not reaching its full potential. And here we often see that showing up in the economic data as a higher than expected, higher than necessary unemployment rate. On the other hand, the Fed historically raises interest rates if the activity in the economy gets ahead of itself. This means basically that the economy, for a variety of reasons, is growing too fast, and that if it were allowed to continue to grow that fast, ultimately there would be imbalances that would develop, and that would cause economic turmoil. So we try to get ahead of those kinds of episodes by raising the interest rate. Now, obviously, to conduct monetary policy, given this description, we need to very closely monitor economic conditions. Now, turning to the next slide, the most important single measure of the economy is economic growth. This is measured by something called real GDP, gross domestic product. Simply put, this is the dollar value of all the goods and services we in the US produce, and we typically take a reading every 3 months, every quarter. This chart scrolls back over a decade and shows how fast the economy, measured by GDP, has grown. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, you see a shaded gray area and several negative bars. That was the Great Recession that lasted about 18 months and was the most severe economic downturn in the US economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, in this chart, it looks almost quaint. It looks fairly small, fairly insignificant. But I can tell you that that's only because if we look at the far, we've had to rescale the chart. And if we look at the far right-hand side, we see those incredible negative bars, both for the first quarter and the second quarter, end of March through the end of June. This, of course, driven by the COVID-19 pandemic, and in an effort to contain the public health problem, a shutdown of many parts of the U.S. economy. Now, this is very important, obviously, in defining the current conditions surrounding manufacturing activity, and it's unprecedented. We've never had this kind of a sudden downturn in the U.S. economy. Now, interestingly enough, we expect the third quarter number, that the third quarter ended yesterday, September 30, we expect that to be as strong as the second quarter was weak. The economy contracted around 30% in the second quarter. That's that negative bar. And we expect it to rebound about the same amount in the third quarter. And that would seem to indicate happy days are here again. We've gotten through this episode. We're back to normal. But that's not quite true. The problem is something called the economic base, the size of the economy. Normally, even during the Great Recession, when the economy contracts, it contracts just a few percent in a given quarter. That means that when it subsequently rebounds by the same amount, it is roughly an offset. This time it's different. Because the economy contracted 30%, when we grow 30% off that much lower level, it means even though the two rates of growth look to be offsetting one another, the economic size of the economy still falls quite short. Lastly, I want to say about this slide, if we're looking forward at the Federal Reserve projections of the economy, we'll see those dots on the far right-hand side. Those suggest a negative 2020, a return to some positive growth in 2021, and then continued growth in the following couple of years, though tapering down a bit. Now, with this drop in economic activity, we want to turn to the next slide, which looks at basically employment, jobs in the economy. Again, on the far right-hand side, we'll see those jobs lost during the Great Recession. And this was considered a very severe episode. In total, those negative bars constituted about 8.2 million jobs lost. And that was a big deal. After that period, you'll note a long period, over 10 years, of steady economic growth. And that growth looks very modest, but I can tell you that it wasn't. By historic standards, it was extraordinarily strong. About 200,000 net new jobs per month, year after year for a decade. In total during that period, we offset that 8+ million jobs lost during the Great Recession and added about another 12 million. In total then, there were about 20 million jobs created during that period. But if we look at the right-hand side, we lost all 20 million plus in April of this year alone. Since then, if we were to total up those job gains in recent months down in that little table, we would see that we've regained about 11 million of the roughly 21-ish million jobs lost, meaning that we've been growing jobs in recent months, but we're still about 10 to 11 million short of where we were pre-pandemic. Going on to the next slide now, we might ask what this means for the unemployment rate. And we'll see that the unemployment rate, again, returning to the Great Recession on the right-hand side, skyrocketed at that time, reaching about 10.fraction%. With all those jobs we created, we'll note that steady, in fact, dramatic by historic standards, decline in unemployment for the following 10 years. But then we see, of course, the pandemic. We see an unprecedented rise in the unemployment rate to over 14%. We're bringing that down. Our most recent reading, that for August, we'll get September in a few days, actually. But in August, that had been brought down to about 8.4%. Nonetheless, that's still about 5% above where it was pre-pandemic. Moving on to the next slide, we might ask ourselves then, if this is what's going on in the overall economy, how's manufacturing faring? And the first thing I'll say, and I'll return to this, is that manufacturing is what we call pro-cyclical. That means as the economy improves, the manufacturing sector improves. But when the economy weakens, as it did with the Great Recession, as it certainly did with the pandemic, manufacturing typically is hard hit. And that was the case. We saw manufacturing activity drop off a cliff along with these broader measures of the economy earlier this year. But more recently, we've been seeing improvement in the sector. This is the ISM, Institute of Supply Management Index. It's a reading on manufacturing activity taken every month. And over time, over decades, it's been a fairly reliable indicator and timely one of conditions in the manufacturing sector. You'll note that the overall Purchasing Managers Index, the table on the left-hand side, had readings in the 50s in both July and August. And a little trick in understanding what these numbers mean is that if the number is above 50, things are improving. Below 50, they're weakening. So we're seeing fairly steady growth, fairly steady strengthening in manufacturing activity. That's also true in production. It's stronger still because it's making up for that lost production in part from the COVID shock. We're seeing new orders strong. Employment is starting to get back to normal, but we're still seeing some lingering effects in the employment side, some losses there. But overall, we're seeing a rebound in manufacturing, but we expect this not to be terribly quick. Because of social distancing, because of a fall off in demand, we saw sharp decline in manufacturing. It's going to take a little bit longer than the services side of the economy to recover. Moving on now to the next slide, we see this overall manufacturing activity in the nation. That's the dark line. And we see what's been going on in the 5th Federal Reserve District. And that's the 5-state area we at the Richmond Fed oversee. That's North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia, Maryland, and Virginia. And note that activity in our district typically roughly tracks measures of activity in the nation. Looking at the far right-hand side, you'll note the dramatic fall off, but now the recovery that was indicated in the district, indicated by those ISM numbers I just showed you in the nation overall. To go into a bit of detail of the various measures we look at, I can tell you that in August, in our latest survey, we saw not only an increase, as shown on this chart, in overall activity, but we saw also optimism for the next 6 months. We saw an increase in new orders in our district, and we saw an increase here in employment. While it's still lagging in the nation overall, we're recovering a bit faster in the 5th district, and we're already seeing positive numbers. In fact, we're hearing from employers in manufacturing sector now, a return to these, we can't find enough workers, enough skilled workers for our needs. So recovery is happening overall. Picture's a bit mixed in the nation. It's happening a bit faster in our district. Moving now to the next chart, we see this pro-cyclical nature of manufacturing that I mentioned. We'll note that the big declines here are found in the early part of this decade. We had a recession at that point around 2008, 2009. That was the Great Recession I've referred to several times. And lastly, at the far side of this, we see the pandemic effects. And so we see that manufacturing employment, both in South Carolina and in the nation, closely track one another generally, but that it's very pro-cyclical. As we match up these dips, they match exactly to recessionary periods. This would look dire if we were to end the chart right in mid-2020, but we've seen that the future in terms of the data suggests a far brighter picture. Moving on to the next chart and the final one, I just want to mention a little bit about the composition of manufacturing, because as the economy overall has many sectors and they're not always in sync, within manufacturing, of course, there are many subsectors. And we see that some are growing, some are shrinking. And this is true not only in short periods of time, but in longer periods as well. This shows the composition of manufacturing growth in it over various subsectors over many years. Now note in the top, the bottom bar is the most recent. We're seeing growth in areas like transportation equipment, food manufacturing, metals, motor vehicles, and areas like aerospace as well. If we look at the bottom three measures, you'll note that there are other sectors in the economy that have been contracting in areas such as apparel, areas such as textiles, and others. I think what this highlights is that manufacturing is not a one-size-fits-all. Various sectors are growing globally, growing in the nation, growing in South Carolina, other sectors in long-term decline. This is important both for firms, obviously, but also for those who are thinking about a career in the manufacturing sector. These new areas that we're seeing of growth tend to pivot more quickly. They tend to be more technology-based. They tend to require higher skill sets, and those skill sets will change more rapidly, both because products are evolving and the production processes in these higher tech sectors are evolving as well. With that, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I enjoyed it. I hope it was a bit useful, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Ray. That was fascinating stuff. I'm sure we'll have some questions in the chat a little bit later. I'm going to turn it over now to Mark Ferris, again, to give us kind of an idea of what's happening on the ground more locally and regionally, and to talk about the importance of manufacturing, what they do as an economic development organization in our community. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. Thanks, Ray. That was great. Certainly, we're excited to see those growth numbers because those are some of our targeted industries here in Greenville. But just a word about GADC. We are the entity that is recruiting manufacturing companies, certainly distribution, office projects. We're responsible for trying to raise the per capita income of every citizen in Greenville County by facilitating that investment. So we always start our presentations with our mission. But on the next slide, you'll see that we look at the manufacturing sector in Greenville. 30,000 folks employed in manufacturing. That's 27% above the per capita national average. We've had a positive increase in the last couple of years, slower than the nation, but certainly in those selected industries that Ray talked about, we've seen substantial increase. The next figure about earnings, that's something that we need to work on. Certainly when you think about manufacturing, value-added processing, and the growth of the Southeast in general, it stretches back to textiles and the concept that, companies from the Northeast, the more industrialized states came to the South seeking, cheap land, cheap labor, cheap cost of operations. That certainly is not true anymore, but we still have a little bit of legacy in terms of those salaries as compared to the entire nation. So we're working on that diligently with our partners, including the Chamber and others. So we're trying to get that number increased, but that's still pretty substantial. And we can talk more about how manufacturing has changed. The next slide, I think Hank shows, this is a question that I get a lot from speaking to Rotary clubs. Well, what type of companies do you see in Greenville County when they come to visit? What are they doing? Well, again, we're known as a place that makes things. Bobby Hitt at South Carolina Department of Commerce uses that almost every time he speaks. He talks about how value-added processing in South Carolina is good at doing that, and certainly in certain sectors, most recently automotive. But manufacturing still dominates the landscape in terms of the kinds of companies that we see. I will say that's different though. The manufacturing that we're seeing, I know Jeff Amelt at GE, of course, they have a large facility here in Greenville, but I have a favorite quote of his where he said, you go to bed one night, you're a manufacturer, you wake up the next morning, you're an IT company. And that's certainly true because the manufacturing sector has lost jobs. There's no doubt about it. But it's interesting that productivity has increased exponentially, especially over the last 3 or 4 decades. and that's through automation and technology, and that'll continue. You know, it's funny. I think back when after the Great Recession, everybody talked about the jobless recovery, and I don't think that was the case in manufacturing. I think what happened is companies took that time to invest in technology. So they made their machine and equipment more efficient. They increased their investment, capital investment in that kind of activity. It made them more productive, and they could do more with less employees. And at the end of the day, that is the goal of every manufacturer, to look at EBITDA and think about how that impacts the bottom line, but to increase productivity and in some cases even eliminate jobs towards that goal. So and I think we're seeing a little bit of that, you know, post-COVID. I think a lot of companies, the smart ones, are going out investing in technology, new equipment. We're working with a company now, an existing company here in Greenville, that is going to be anticipating about a $50 million investment. All of it is in machine and equipment, and they're doing that in preparation for that next generation of manufacturing activity that gives them a more productive stance going forward and able to compete on a global level. But the next slide, Hank, I think shows that just if you look over the last couple of years, we've had some pretty substantial wins. We averaged about 25 wins, but the last couple of years we've had substantially higher than that. Last year we announced 31 companies, despite, and I think you saw in Ray's graphs, that manufacturing began to decline even before COVID. And certainly we saw that. We were very concerned last year about our activity, but it kind of bounced back. And the next slide talks about the jobs. And certainly, sorry, that's the capital investment. We reached over 400 million last year. Right now, we're at 300 million, thanks to a rather large investment that we announced a couple of weeks ago, a company called DC Blocks. This year, I won't put on rose-colored glasses. It's going to be bad in terms of job creation, certainly, and comparison to capital investment, it's going to be down. You know, I think everybody's experiencing that. I think there are places in South Carolina that are somewhat insulated from that, and you know, the Charleston area and the Greenville area are the two that all the statistics show are doing, you know, as well as could be expected in the COVID time. So going forward, Hank, this is a slide that I love to show because a lot of people say, well, what does that mean to the community? What does $400 million in capital investment among those companies return to the community? So last year, we had almost 2,200 new jobs announced. If you look at the salaries, the goods and services purchased, even, you know, we look at visitors. For example, a manufacturing facility may have clients and suppliers and customers that come into Greenville and spend the night and spend money. So we even count that. But that 400 million on an annual basis will generate 73 million in revenue to Greenville County. And so when we, you know, we're the entity in Greenville that is responsible for negotiating incentives. And of course, that is that's become an inordinately large part of our job, especially in the last decade, probably. But if we think about what the return on investment is for every dollar of property tax that we negotiate away in terms of incentives to companies, there's a $17 return. And we're really, really proud of that. We use that as a benchmark in terms of what we do in terms of offering incentive deals to companies. But the average salary of those jobs, almost $25, that's a little higher than the state average. Again, a little lower than the national average. So, but the impact is pretty substantial for that investment. So going forward, Hank. So yeah, Ray talked about some of those growth industries. Thank goodness we have that aligns pretty well with our targeted industries. Automotive, obviously the benchmark location of BMW in 1992 in our area generated that kind of demand. The supplier network, tier 1, 2 suppliers but obviously Charleston's done very well recently with Mercedes Sprinter van facility, and most recently the Volvo facility. So automotive is a huge, and of course that term is becoming mobility as opposed to automotive. So your automotive connotes a combustion engine, and of course most of our companies are looking towards all electric vehicles and even hydrogen fuel cells. We had a company, Purebird in Greenville, announce an investment, pretty substantial investment last year. We visited them, and they were showing us their products, and as they were talking about their next generation, they're planning for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as being a standard going forward, and they're already adapting to that for some of their products. But it was interesting to listen to them talk about how that sector is changing, and the word automotive is now being almost used as opposed to the mobility word is used as opposed to automotive. Aviation, of course, we're real proud of Lockheed Martin facility. You may have seen some of the announcements there about the F-16 and the orders that they've received for that aircraft. That's obviously being sold primarily to our allies in the world, but the orders for that were well above, I think, what Lockheed had anticipated. So that's going to generate interest in terms of companies looking at Greenville for that. But as part of that, that's a wide range of potential companies. We had a company that makes aviation equipment for transit. So in other words, they're using the equipment this company makes for planes that are transportation related as opposed to moving people. They just announced a new facility here. Office and headquarters. I know we're here to talk about manufacturing, but that's been a huge sector for us, a huge growth sector. In 2018, we announced more office projects in Greenville County than manufacturing, which was a benchmark for us since the organization was started in 2001. That's the first time in our history that we worked more successful office projects than manufacturing. So we are seeing a little bit of diversification towards that. Advanced materials, got a lot of companies, life sciences, that's seen a lot of growth. And I'll comment on one of the things that Ray said, the food processing operation. We're not known in the upstate as being a huge food process. That's Midwest and some other areas of the U.S., but we've seen 3 projects recently in food processing, which is kind of a new thing for us. I think COVID has revealed a lot of supply chain issues with food products, and so companies are scrambling to try to adapt to that and are looking at doing more regional food processing kind of operations. So we're definitely seeing a growth in that. Next slide, Hank. So this is something that I throw out that astounds people sometimes when we talk about how valuable manufacturing and industries are to Greenville. Less than 10% of the county is zoned for industrial, but it generates 50% of the property taxes that goes towards schools, police, fire, roads, other things that are part of cost of community services. So we certainly need, as Greenville County continues to grow incredibly from a residential standpoint, we need to think about that balance, because the industries and businesses are the ones that generate the vast majority of property taxes that services the growth in residential. So that's a statistic that I like to throw out to show folks how critically important it is that we attract new companies and assist companies with expansions locally. Next slide, Hank. So this is a statistic that I think is revealing. We before COVID, Hank and the city of Greenville and some of our other partners were sitting around. Cheryl certainly was involved in this, but we're wringing our hands talking about, how are we going to get the workers that we need? It's funny, in the COVID, the last 8 months of COVID, and knock on wood, I hadn't had one company cancel a project with us because of COVID. But prior to COVID, we had several companies cancel projects because they just couldn't find labor. So the labor issue is a more critical one. As we rebound, it's going to be critical. It's not necessarily just the supply of bodies. It's about skill sets. Again, as these companies invest in technology, as they become more productive and efficient, the skill set required to run those machines is 2 to 3 levels above what we were seeing in the textile industry. So we have to have a trained workforce. But one of the things that is a little troubling in manufacturing is the aging out. You know, most of our workers in that manufacturing sector, in fact, almost 50% are in the age category of 45 to 64. So that's a real troubling statistic for us in terms of being able to supply those jobs that are needed for those companies as they grow and expand. Next slide. We are certainly an international location. Greenville, you know, walking down the streets of Greenville when I was had my sons come to visit as we were looking at taking the job here 5 years ago, and I talked about how, you know, the BMW facility and others have generated the kind of international interest in the upstate, and sure enough, as we were walking to dinner, we heard Italian, we heard Japanese, we heard Russian. One of my sons even recognized the Russian language being spoken. So we are an international city. Germany and Western Europe certainly dominates that, but we certainly have a lot of Asian companies as well. So that's a critical thing to consider moving forward. We need these allies and making sure that we have a more sustainable economy, and we need to continue to have that inward investment from these companies, and we're working diligently with all our partners to do that. The next slide shows where those flags are, and if you notice in South Carolina, again, we kind of in the upstate dominate from especially a manufacturing perspective. Those companies that are international tend to end up here as opposed to either Columbia or even Charleston. So we are still the kind of the upstate is the manufacturing mecca for the state of South Carolina. I'll give you a quick story. I had a reporter call me after Volvo announced in Charleston, and she said, well, Charleston is becoming the manufacturing center of South Carolina. And I kind of chuckled, and she said, what are you laughing at? I said, well, do me a favor, go add up manufacturing companies in Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester, and compare the number to Spartanburg, Anderson, and Greenville. And she called me back later and she laughed, and she found that we had 4 times the number of manufacturing companies in the upstate as in the low country. So we are still the manufacturing center of the state of South Carolina. Next slide. So that vehicle there shows that we certainly, South Carolina leads the nation in automotive exports, primarily because most of those beautiful cars end up going overseas. But we're continuing to see growth in this industry. The next slide talks about some of the assets that we have in Greenville. Hank, if you would go ahead. iCar, you know, I used to ride down I-85 when I worked in a competing community. I would glance over at that tiger paw and think, gosh, that's an incredible asset for this area. The research and development that goes on in that facility creates a lot of interest. You know, we do a lot of international trade shows. I'll tell you a story that we travel overseas sometimes to the auto shows, especially the large one in Frankfurt. We meet with companies who have an investment interest in the upstate, and as a group, a lot of times I'm meeting with my competitors in other counties in South Carolina in front of this company. And, you know, every community wants to get their shots in about how they're great and how they're the best and how how they have the most to offer. But when the discussion comes up about research and development, all of my peers turn to me, and I get to talk about CU iCar and the exciting things that are going on out there and the kind of activity. Again, you know, they're amending their model towards a mobility path as opposed to the automotive. And that's certainly gaining wider appeal to the companies that are interested in being part of that transition. But we also, Hank, on the next slide, we have ITIC. A lot of folks don't know about this, but the old Donaldson Air Center, now SC TAC, has the International Transportation Innovation Center. They have the kind of research and development going on out there. The last time I was out there, they were showing me a test bed where they were learning to recharge electric vehicles as they drove over the asphalt. So they were implanting wireless chargers into the asphalt, and the car was actually being charged as it drove over those wireless chargers. So it's pretty exciting, some of the stuff going out there. There's a lot of, again, mobility kind of things that were applicable to that. As we get towards autonomous vehicles, obviously there has to be a lot of testing done, and ITIC will be part of that going forward. And on the next slide, Hank, I think I only have a couple more, but some of our strategic initiatives, you know, as we grow significantly in Greenville, we need to make sure we're creating an inventory for future development for the companies that have an interest in growing, coming to Greenville and expanding. And so we've spent about a 3-year period trying to identify those sites, and we've made pretty good progress towards that. We have our first new business park in 20 years, Fox Hill, near the intersection of 385 and 418 in the Fountain Inn area. When I came to Greenville, we had no speculative buildings. 70% of those projects that look at Greenville County look first for existing facilities. They want existing buildings. They don't sometimes want to go through the risk involved in building a facility. So those speculative buildings are critical to success. We have 5 of those either planned or under construction right now. I'll show you a picture of Fox Hill. This is kind of the layout for the business park there. 170 acres. It could accommodate over 2 million square feet of space. We have 2 buildings under construction there already. The developer is a group called Sudler. They're out of New Jersey. They came in, bought the entire tract of property, and we're excited about being partnered with them and other allies towards the development of this site. It's going to be great. This is a new facility off of Harrison Bridge Road, a new speculative building. These are the kind of things that we need. You see, this is all the dock doors. This is designed to be a cross dock facility. Distribution logistics have become incredibly important to us. Again, I think COVID has revealed a lot of issues with supply chain. And so distribution logistics companies are scrambling to try to make sure that they learn the lessons of that, and they're doing things differently. But this facility is one of those speculative buildings that are critical to our success going forward. And Hank, I think that's all I have.
Very good. So I am somewhat encouraged. I think, Ray, your data painted the picture that things may be down right now, but they're improving, that there may be a path forward. Mark, what you say is spot on in terms of there are opportunities out there. So we had one question in the chat thus far. If folks do want to ask a question, please put it into the chat and I will read them out as we get them. But this question really was around more of a definition, I think, than anything, Ray, was about textiles. And are you including advanced engineering textiles? When you talk about textiles, I think that was things like non-wovens, carbon fiber. And I'll throw it to you too, Mark. How does that play into our economy?
Oh.
So Ray, you want to take that first and then to Mark?
Well, Mark probably knows more than I do. I'm using my cell because I'm having some problems with volume. Anyway, that's it. So to my knowledge, which is limited, the textiles here are the ones that are classified by the NAICS. And my guess is they may not include carbon fiber and things of that sort. But
yeah, I think that's advanced materials primarily. But obviously, if you think about, we have a company here that is beginning to make equipment for masks. It's the blown kind of medium that goes into the K95 masks. They are not classified as textile. They're classified as advanced materials, although the process is very similar. So if you think about what a textile mill used to look like, you know, with the exception of the weaving of material, the looms and things. The non-wovens are still a linear process. You have a lot of calendars, a lot of rollers, a lot of similar processes to treating cloth after its production. But obviously the process is different. It looks similar, but yeah, that has its own NAICS code.
Okay. Okay. Well, from y'all's perspectives, Ray and Mark, do you have any particular message to any students or parents or teachers that happen to see this video as we move forward about manufacturing? Ray?
Well, again, I suspect Mark is an expert compared to me. That said, the slides that I presented, and certainly the information Mark presented, suggests that manufacturing is not your grandfather's manufacturing, but rather it's a high-tech industry. That suggests that a faster moving pace also suggests that a skill set that's in your pocket and mobile. You may be moving between industries, between various producers, perhaps between various product lines. So we've always thought of service sector, you needed your skills in your pocket because of the mobility. Manufacturing is starting to more closely mimic that kind of a model. So more education, more training, more general understanding that's transferable will be key.
I like your skills in your pocket, kind of transferable skills that go from employer to employer. I like that idea. Mark.
Yeah, I think, Hank, I tell the story a lot. Of course, again, there's a perception that manufacturing is what we, at least in the South, remember the ladies and gentlemen coming out of the facilities covered in lint, and it was dangerous sometimes, and obviously that is not the case. I tell the story. My son, after 5 years at Clemson, was able to graduate with an engineering degree. He was very proud that he got out, offered a job, $60,000 a year. His brother, who was in finance classes at the time and had just written a paper, we were at dinner once and he was saying, well, if you had gone to 2 years at Greenville Tech, gotten a mechatronics degree, you could start at Michelin making the same amount in a manufacturing facility. And he was exactly right. And that is where I think that we've got to change that perception, because manufacturing has become so sophisticated. Certainly we got to train to meet those skill sets, but our success, and COVID aside, obviously there are a lot of issues that we need to think about in terms of COVID. How do we go forward and what happens in the future? But assuming that confidence is restored, a lot of these companies that we have seen sitting on the sidelines are going to all rush in. It's going to be wide open. They still have capacity issues. They'll have demand increase, and they'll want to make that capital investment to meet that capacity and demand, and they're going to need those employees. And so we're still going to have that issue in terms of training, workforce preparation. That's why I'm so proud of the chamber and the stuff that y'all are doing with Accelerate and the emphasis on education. That's going to be critical to our success as a community. But that manufacturing process has become so sophisticated and so high tech that you're again going to be more a technician than a laborer, in the sense that, and if you look at some of the job availability, that reflects that immediately, and that pay scale has gone up as a result. So I'm excited about Greenville County, how we're positioning ourselves, things like the Center for Manufacturing Innovation, the 3D printing that is becoming ubiquitous. GE has a facility here, a research and development facility that is doing 3D printing with metal. And so if you think about metalworking, Ray mentioned that as being a growth industry. You think about the subtractive kind of process where you bring in a bar of metal and you shave it down to create this part that goes into components of automotives or aviation or whatever. Now they're using 3D printing powdered metals to create that part. So So think about the incredible frontier that sits before us, where you don't have rows of CNC machines. You have a couple of 3D printing operations or 3D printing machines that, you don't necessarily have to have inventory. You can customize for every client that you have. You can add the heat resistance and wear resistance with the components of the powdered metals that you use. So I'm very excited thinking about that. But Greenville, thank goodness, is on the leading edge of some of that research and development with our partners, Clemson University, Greenville Tech. The CMI facility is a stake in the ground for that kind of stuff.
Well, would like to just mention that this is an exciting topic. We can tell you're excited about it as well. We'll be having 3 more webinars this month, beginning on October 15th will be the next one with Ryan Burns, who's the Human Resource Director at AFL, a global headquarters company here in the upstate. And we're going to be talking about all the different occupations, not just the plant floor technical occupations, but everything that's required to run a manufacturing facility, because they have needs from marketing to accounting to supply chain to logistics to machine tool, everything. We'll be talking on October 22nd with David Clayton with Clemson University International Center for Automotive Research, kind of titled it Industry 4.0, 5.0, Robotics and Other Technologies. Do Humans Have a Future? Lots of interesting things going on in terms of technology and manufacturing production processes. And then the end of the month, we'll be talking with Mike Hickey with Sandvik Coromant, and then Abul Hassan from the Greenville Technical College's Center for Manufacturing Innovation to talk about launching your career and partnering with employers, because employers really are nowadays much more encouraging and thinking about career pathways and helping their employees figure out how do you get from point A to point D within their company and moving up the career ladder. And a lot of them are willing to help you get back to school. Like you said, Mark, you may not need to incur a lot of debt in 8 years of education. You might be able to find some employers that are willing to help you along that path.
Yep.
I think Greenville's full of those employers. So we typically end these webinars with a message of hope and optimism. And I want to throw this back to Cam Varner. And any messages from your perspective, Cam, for our audience today? And I don't think we can hear you, Cam. Well, I'm just want to say thank you, Cam, for your sponsorship and partnership for this event. Ray, thank you. Mark, thank you. This recording will be shared on the Greenville Chamber's website, sent to attendees along with a survey. If you please fill that out for us. And we hope you will join us on October 15th, again, as we speak with Ryan Burns from AFL. And if you would, just please do your part in helping stop the spread of the coronavirus. Mask up when you can and socially distance when you need to. And just have a great day and stay safe. So thank you, everybody.